Hi, I'm Andy Wallach. We are here on Marco Island. It is December 1994. Very Merry Christmas to all of you.
And that goes for me too. You've been suggesting to us that we do something like this. We've been handed articles about family histories. We've been handed books with blank pages, and some even with just fill in the blanks. And finally, we're going to take you for a little page through your family album and hope you'll enjoy it.
We've been working on this for well over a year. We thought we'd have it ready for you for Christmas last year. Finally, the camera's rolling. Let's hope this one works out well. On to the family. My father's father was John Wallach. He was born in Holland to a family in the diamond business. He had a sister named Wilhelmina. That's all I know about the Dutch branch. When he was young, his mother died. His father remarried, and John was sent to Paris to school, boarding school. There, of course, he learned French. When, as an adult, he immigrated to the United States, he naturally tried to board with a family who spoke French. Wound up at the Ducharme House on State Street near Lake in Chicago, where the State Lake Theater now stands. When he was 50 years old, he married the 16-year-old daughter of the house. My father was their only child. John worked for Montgomery Ward and Company in their mail receiving department. He eventually rose to be head of it, and my father was very proud of the fact that his father was considered honest enough to handle all the cash that came in every day with the orders. Interesting, huh? My father's mother was Laura Ducharme Wallach Grant. As I said, she married when she was 16 years old, and she didn't have a particularly healthy life. She was in and out of hospitals a great deal. However, most of the time I knew her, she hopped around like a little cricket. The last time I saw her, she came out of her house looking very much like she does in this picture, looked up and down the street like a little bird, and hopped off to wherever the heck she was going. This picture was taken at our wedding in 1949. When my father was going to be married in 1926, he had saved up $20,000. He divided the money in half, gave his mother $10,000, and kept the other $10,000 for himself and his bride. What happens at their wedding? But my Mama Grant turned up with her groom of 2 weeks, Claude Grant. A very dashing-looking railroad man, worked for the Northwestern as a freight conductor. He worked long after retirement age, well into World War II, and during that period I remember him as often getting home at 8 o'clock in the morning and having to leave again at 4 in the afternoon to be back on the job to haul the goods for the war. Here's Mama Grant and Grandpa Claude at my sister Ginger's wedding, 5 years after we were married. They lived some years after this. Then Mama Grant had a stroke one afternoon, died 2 days later in her own bed. Grandpa Claude was pretty sick with Parkinson's disease by now, and he had to go into a nursing home. 3 weeks or so later, I was driving home from downtown one day, and I thought of going to visit him, and didn't really want to go, so I resisted, but finally turned around and went back. I found him comatose, not in good shape at all. I remembered how he had indicated an interest in becoming a Catholic, so I told the sister about this, and she told the priest. The priest came over, and they talked to him about it a while and asked him to squeeze their hand if he was interested, and they thought maybe he did. So he was baptized that night. I was the godfather of my own step-grandfather. Next day he woke up and he told the sister, "Did you know I became a Catholic last night?" And he was very happy about it. So that was fine. A little bit later the same day, all of a sudden, unexpectedly really, he died. I was kind of pleased that I'd been on hand to help him out a little bit. I think this is kind of a nice picture of my father and his mother, my grandmother, taken at our wedding in 1949. They didn't really get together a great deal. We went to visit her every couple of weeks or so for a short time on Sunday. That was it. Unfortunately, this is the only picture I have of any of the D family. This is a snapshot taken at Lake Beulah, Wisconsin in the late 1930s. In the upper right is my sister Mary Alyce. Next is little buddy Wallach, then Marion D. Wallach, my mother, and on the far left is Thomas Francis D., my grandfather. Tom D. was one of 4 brothers. All of them had white hair in a picture I saw of them all when they were fairly young. He was a buyer for Marshall Fields and Company, bought a new home at 116 South Mason with his wife, Marion Shea. Their house was between Madison and Adams, 1 block east of Austin. He never owned a horse and carriage or an automobile, always took the Madison streetcar to work every day. When the Madison streetcar line was extended, the D family was the closest to the end of the line at Austin and Madison, and the conductors and trainmen would walk the block and a half to their house for tea and coffee in cold weather. The backyard had no garage or barn, was used mostly for a vegetable garden for family use. They had a newfangled indoor bathroom, cold water only, hot water for the bath, carried from a small heater in the kitchen. 4 bedrooms upstairs. Heating was gravity, hot air registers in the floor, opened only as needed to allow warm air to rise to the 2nd floor. Hand-stoked coal furnace had to be banked each night and stoked carefully each morning. Too much coal or dust would drown out the fire. Originally, lighting was by gas wall lights. Father D. was head usher at St. Catherine's of Siena as long as I can remember, and Sunday morning from early Mass until probably 1 p.m. were spent at church. He was also very active in the St. Vincent de Paul Society, visiting the county jail with tracts and, I suppose, the poor, although most people were poor from 1929 to 1939. His wife, Marion Shea D., Mama D., was born and raised in Chicago. She had 3 surviving sisters: Alyce Lardner, Nellie Sankey, spelled S-A-N-K-E, who was childless, Mabel Enright, who had 4 children, 2 daughters and 2 sons, one a Jesuit priest. The D's, Marion and Tom, had 5 surviving children: Thomas F. Jr., Herbert, Eugene, Marion, my mother, and Alyce, who married Reginald Hogan. They also had twins who died, presumably of starvation, in that day a few, if any, feeding supplements. My grandmother had a cerebral blood clot in June of 1941 and lived at home in a semi-comatose state for over 2 years. Much earlier, she had a high blood pressure incident of some kind. Her doctor, Dr. Wright, tried some new experimental treatment that saved her for her family and made a name for himself, and from there on he treated her free for the rest of his life. We lived about three quarters of a mile away, and when old enough, I would visit frequently. I have a letter that I think speaks for itself. It's from TFD, 116 South Mason Avenue, Chicago, Illinois, to Master Andrew Wallach, Jr., care of Ed Nutt, Namacoggin Lodge, Webb Lake, Wisconsin. Chicago, Monday, 12 o'clock noon. This is 7/21/41. Dear Bud, I just received your letter from Ed Nutt's, asking me to ask your father and mother to let you know if you can stay longer. I talked with your mother, and she said she thought it would be good for you, but she said she wanted to consult your father before deciding. I asked her to tell him, as a special favor to me, to say yes. I advise you to remain where you are until you hear from them. Your loving grandfather. Here it is. It's not in bad shape for something that's well over 50 years old, is it? And now on to the Gibbons and Harity side of the family.
This is a daguerreotype, better known as a tintype, so it's on metal and one of the first kinds of photography. This is a picture, we believe, of my great-grandparents. My great-grandmother's name was Jane White. My great-grandfather was John or Joseph Clark. We're not sure about that. He was a baker. Troubles in Ireland at that time made it very hard to make a living. So he had gone to London to earn his living as a baker. Later on in my life, when I discovered my grandfather had been born in London, I was very excited, and I thought perhaps I was related to royalty. And my grandfather looked at me and said, just because Jesus Christ was born in a stable, it didn't make him an ass, and you're not English. This is a picture of Jane White Clark, taken with a child. I'm not sure who the child is. I also should mention that the Clark has an E on the end of it, and that was very, very important to my grandfather. My grandfather told me he had 2 brothers and 2 sisters. There was Joseph, James, Elizabeth, who married John Berthold, and Mary, who married John Bowman. The 2 women lived in Oak Park, and so did their progeny. My grandfather was very devoted to his mother, and that is the beginning of the tradition of the name Jane in our family. This is a picture of Florence McCarthy, my great-grandfather. He married Mary Ann Haggerty. It was evidently a great marriage, at least we hope so. They had 14 children. They lived on Morgan Street in Holy Family Parish and moved to St. Ignatius when the Jesuits founded a parish there. They built a home at 1141 Columbia Avenue in Rogers Park. Don't be fooled if you ever go to find it thinking that it's been torn down and an apartment put in its place. It was built this way so that when some of the children got married, they could remain with the family in the home and each have their privacy. The house was on the block near the lake, and it was very close to Calvary Cemetery. When Florence McCarthy died, my great-grandmother was a familiar sight, walking to Calvary every day with Teddy to visit Florence's grave. Florence McCarthy was a twin, and they had 2 sets of twins themselves. The clock that you children remember from the mantle in our living room was a gift Florence McCarthy gave to his twin brother on the occasion of his marriage. He lived in Ohio and had no grandchildren, so the clock came back to our family. Of all the children the McCarthys had, there were only 4 grandchildren and 6 great-grandchildren, none bearing the McCarthy name. I'll give you an idea of some of the names of the 14 children that I know about. There was Mary Ellen, the oldest, Hannah, Kate, Grace, the youngest, Aunt Floss, Agnes, Laura, John, and Florence, also a male. Of all of them, Grace was the adventurer. She traveled the world. She's been to places that I haven't ever thought of going and imagined that many years ago. A great family story that I really loved when I was a child was about my great-grandmother McCarthy and her constant companion, her water spaniel, Teddy. After she died, they had the wake at home. That was the tradition in those days. And somehow Teddy got into the house during the wake. He went over to the casket, howled, and they had to take him out, and he died the next day. Here is where it all started for the Gibbons family. Both Mary Harity and Jeffrey Gibbons came from County Mayo, and as is said by all Irish, County Mayo, God help us. This is Clew Bay. It's on the road between Lewisburg and Westport. Jeffrey Gibbons was from Lewisburg, and Mary Harity was from Westport. Here we are in the center of Westport. This is the place where Dad went in and asked where the Harity home was so we could go and visit it. Westport's a pretty little town on the River Mall, that's M-A-L-L, and this is the High Street. The story was that the Harity family sold milk from a little dairy at the top of the High Street. This is the street where Carabone, which means dear girl in Gaelic, is located. This is the family home, and we're now approaching it. Here's Carabone, where my grandmother, Mary Harity, was born. Doesn't it remind you of the picture over Drew's mantle? Here it is, the place where Mary Harity was born. Her father married twice. He married 2 sisters, and he had 10 children by each sister. Can you imagine the size of that family in this home? If you notice, on the side is a small addition where I'm sure the modern conveniences are. Unbeknownst to us, the people Grandy asked the directions of had called ahead to tell someone that the relatives from America were on their way out. And out comes a cousin, Michael Flanagan, to meet me. His mother and my grandmother were sisters. Here's Michael and I. Note the palm tree in the background. I guess that southern atmosphere was in my blood. Notice the height of Michael and the slimness, and does he look familiar? Dr. Bertuzzi always asked me, where did Dick come from? I guess we found out. He's a Harity. Here's my mom sitting out in front of the family home with another one of the cousins on one of their visits to Ireland. Note the red hair. If ever you come along with a redhead, you won't have to explain it. Here's a picture of Jeffrey Gibbons and his wife, Mary Harity Gibbons. They met in the United States, even though they both had come from the same area of Ireland. At the time, everyone had to leave Ireland to make a living. Naturally, in the case of Mary's family, I know more about it because I heard a lot about it. She had to come. She was the oldest one in her family, and she came as the first one to come over. She stayed with relatives, the name McGrail, who now live in downstate Illinois. That's spelled M-C-G-R-E-A-L, in the Fairbury area. And she worked for them, and then she went into the city of Chicago and worked, I assume as a domestic. She saved her money until she had enough to buy an apartment building, and that was the beginning. She had at least 4 apartment buildings by the time my dad was a little boy. She married Jeffrey at this time, who was a very good-natured man. He was educated, which was unusual for the Irish in those days because they were not allowed to be educated. But he had thought he was going to be a priest, and so special care was given with him. He changed his mind, came to the United States, and found Mary Harity. He worked in Chicago building bridges. He worked for the city of Chicago. When my grandmother Gibbons's relatives started coming over, they all worked for him, and Papa did too as a child. Every one of her brothers that came over came right to the Gibbons's home and lived until they had enough money to buy an apartment building. And so that was the way it went. She had brothers by the name of Patrick. She had brother by the name of Richard, and one Michael, and one Peter, and I believe her real name was Mary Alyce, where my Aunt Alice was named after her mother. I guess she was the first realtor in the family. Jerry Carey is the next one. But in my dad as a child, one of his jobs was going around collecting rents, and he was to sit on the curb until he collected. And they paid by the week lots of times then. Mary was a very attractive woman, but by all accounts, including mine, she was a miserable and difficult woman to live with. My dad really resented the way she treated his father. He loved his father very, very much, and he died while Papa was still a young man.
I'd like to add one little thing in there. I remember Michael Flanagan telling us proudly that they own 20 acres here and 10 acres there and 20 acres here and on, all around the hillside surrounding the family home.
This is my great-uncle, Dick Harity, Mary's brother. He was a charming, handsome man. I loved him. He grew into a silver-haired gentleman, a very distinguished gentleman. He and his wife, Agnes, had 2 children, Joe, the oldest, pictured here, and Bill. An interesting aside about Joe, he did not marry, and at the time of World War II, he was drafted into the service. He was exactly the same age as Papa. So you can see my dad could have served in World War II also. Agnes, his wife, was a fascinating woman. She was a little kind of an elfie type person and told wonderful stories. I used to sit at her knee and have her tell me about the leprechauns. She talked about putting milk out for the little people at night so they'd have something to eat. And I was totally convinced there truly were leprechauns in Ireland.
I first met Uncle Dick at his wife Aunt Agnes's wake. He was a very handsome man, as Jane Alyce has said, and she introduced me to him. Dick and Florence were away at the time, and we had to go representing the family. So the two of us marched up the aisle amidst all the relatives, whispering, "There goes Dick Gibbons's daughter," etc. We got up and met Uncle Dick. Your mom said, "This is my friend Andy Wallach." Uncle Dick, being elderly and kind of hard of hearing, says, "Ah, Andy Walsh, it's a pleasure to meet you." And he goes on. Your mom was going to stop him and correct him, and I said, no, the man's got enough to think about. His wife is lying there dead. Let's just let it go. He won't remember anyway. So at our wedding, up comes Uncle Dick after the ceremony, and he says to her, "You never told me his name was Wallach. I thought all the time he was Walsh." Here's a picture taken at a party at our house showing the Gibbons siblings, and there's some of their spouses. On the far left is Dan McGrath, Nora's husband. In front of him is Florence Clark Gibbons. Next to her is a lady some of you with long memories will remember. That's my first wife, Jane Alyce Gibbons Wallach. Behind her is Uncle Gene Sullivan. Next is Nora McGrath, the little lady in the middle, Nora Gibbons McGrath. Peeking out there is Dick Gibbons, her brother, Anna's father. In front of him and next is Alyce Gibbons Sullivan, Jean's wife, of course. Next to her is Helen Conway, Florence's very long-time dear friend, and Jane Alyce's godmother, who she loved very much. Next, Helen never married. Next to her is Tom Gibbons, who never married. Note in the background the clock on the mantle. That's the clock we talked about before that great-grandfather Florence McCarthy gave to his twin brother when the brother was married.
We cut out all the books. By the time this picture was taken at Dick's wedding, Uncle Tom had died. But this is a picture of my dad, Richard Gibbons, and Alyce Sullivan, his sister, and Nora McGrath, his other sister. Mary Harity Gibbons, again, was a woman who, while working, keeping her brothers in food and being fed and working hard at home, decided that all children's birthdays should be in October. Even though they weren't born in October, they were all celebrated in October. Now, you see, this was not a sentimental woman. Here we are back to the tintypes. This is my grandfather, Alexander J. Clark, as a young boy. Here he is as a little older. You can see he's gotten taller, and look at that hat. He always called himself Alexander the Great. That was his name, because he thought that name was really very pompous for someone like himself. He was a dear man. Now, how proud he'd be to have Alex Wallach named after him. Everyone always said that Drew reminded them of Grandpa Clark. Can you see the resemblance? Here's a picture of Mary Ellen McCarthy. As you know, she was the eldest of 14 children, and she told me she used to remember standing on a box so she could help change the diapers of the new babies. I have a copy of a letter she wrote to her mom and dad on December 24th, 1879, Chicago. My dear parents, I wish you could spend an hour or two with us this morning just to see what a grand time we little folks have writing letters. Everyone wants to write a long letter and no one knows what to say. This may seem strange, but it is the real truth. When we are at home and talking to you, we are never at a loss for words. But when we write a letter, our ideas, as our words, seem to forsake us. Some of the girls would like to have a number of big words in their letter, but I will be perfectly satisfied if I can find enough of little ones to fill up this page. An item of news I cannot give you, for what I know you know. So I will close by wishing you a happy, happy Christmas and New Year, and assuring you of a frequent remembrance in my prayer. I am, my dear parents, your affectionate child, Mary Ellen McCarthy. I stuttered in there because I really can't make it out. It's a pretty old letter. My grandmother had a career as a seamstress for Marshall Field and Company. She would go to the homes of the very wealthy, the Armours, the Cudahy's, the Palmers, and stay every day in their homes and sew their clothes. She made an exquisite quilt of scraps of clothing that she had made for these famous families. My grandfather met her sister Kate and was very taken with her until he got home and met Mary Ellen, and poor Kate was left waiting at the door. I can read you another letter. This letter was written by my grandmother on Thursday, April 5th, 1900. This is going to give you an idea of what love letters were like in those days. Thursday, Mr. A.J. Clark. Friend Al, instead of coming down tonight as you said, I am going that way and will meet you at the same old stand, Roby and 12th at 7:30 or 7:45. I met an old friend of yours yesterday that ain't seen you for a long time and gave me a message to deliver, so I will tell you when I see you tonight. Hoping to see you, I will be along there as near around that time as I can. Now, Al, don't play April Fool, will you? Yours sincerely, Mamie McSee. I guess she was afraid he wouldn't know who she'd be, but she sure wanted him to arrive at that time. This is my grandfather, Alex Clark. If I ever knew a saint, this is the one. He was a lovely, lovely man. He was very much in love with my grandmother. He was a bookbinder by trade. He started working when he was 10 years old, and he worked until he was disabled. Very cruelly, he was robbed on the way home from work one night. They waited until he got into his apartment at Austin and Humphrey and beat him up. They'd followed him from the L. My grandfather only walked for a very short time after that. He was totally disabled and could not walk at all within my memory. My earliest memory of my grandfather is probably going over the night he was beaten and seeing his poor body and the doctor and the police there. It was a very heartbreaking thing. I never heard the man complain in his life. He used to say, "It's all right, I have my Mary Ellen." He called her Mame sometimes, Mamie sometimes, and they had a beautiful relationship. He always wanted her to go out and have a good time even though he couldn't. He loved my mom and my dad very, very much. My father was like a son to him. And my father really mourned the death of my grandmother and grandfather tremendously. They were very sentimental people. I have a cutout of my grandmother of a calendar from an old printing company, and the date of the calendar is September 1900. And circled is the 1st of September with a notation, "This is the day we married." I have another little note from them, from my grandmother to my grandfather, which shows the formality of life in those days. This is dated Chicago, September 1st, 1919. To my dear old pal, congratulations and many happy wedding anniversaries. May God bless and protect us both in the near future. From your side partner, Mamie E. McCarthy Clark, 19 years ago this morning. I guess I'm sentimental too. I spent a lot of time with my Nana and Grandpa in their home. I slept almost every Friday night, overnight with them. I learned what love was, even though there wasn't much money and lots of physical problems.
Here is the 19th anniversary letter from Mary Ellen to Alyce Clark.
Here's a picture of my mom with her mother and father on vacation at Paw Paw Lake in August of 1905. She was 3 years old. My Nana and Grandpa married late in life, and so the addition of their darling child made their life complete. They were devoted to her forever. My grandpa was a bookbinder. He not only bound the books, but in those days they would put gold leaf decorations on the front of books and the titles on the spines of the books. I do have a recollection of going down to visit him when I was a very little girl and seeing him working. He stood on his feet all day long. That's why after his accident there was no possibility of his continuing working. We had some books that he had bound and illuminated with gold leaf. I only wish I knew where they were. They'd be a treasure for the family. In my mom's photo album, this picture was labeled as Sweethearts. She got her love of swimming from my grandpa because he loved to swim, and so did my mother. This picture was taken at Channel Lake in August of 1921.
Florence would be about 19 then, I guess. Jane Alyce didn't really want to show this picture. It shows Mary Ellen in a rowboat, also in the Channel Lake, probably August 1921. I thought it was a very interesting picture.
And look how modest the ladies were in those days. No string bikinis there. Here I am. I've arrived on the scene. It's July of 1929. The back of the picture is marked 1 year, 5 months, but who was counting? I was a very spoiled and pampered grandchild. This picture is taken at Twin Lakes, Wisconsin, where my mom and dad had met.
And we're within about 3 months of the beginning of the Great Depression.
Here's a picture of my grandmother with 4 of her sisters. 3 of her sisters, excuse me. Floss was gone as usual. It was summer, and of course she was in some exotic land. On the left is Laura. She is the mother of Mara Virginia, Murphy, Pfister. You also have Pfister cousins, Pfister. They live in Park Ridge. Hannah is next to Laura, and she was a career woman. She worked for a printing company and was the assistant to Mr. Conklin and was really one of the world's greatest secretaries. Ag, next to her, was a darling. She stayed home and kept house for the McCarthy girls because they couldn't boil water. And there was my Nana. We all had a great time that summer.
Bangs Lake this is.
This is a picture taken just a couple of years before my grandpa died. We were together up at Bangs Lake that summer, and we had a perfectly wonderful time. Not too long after we got back, my Nana had a heart attack. It was very serious, and she couldn't take care of him any longer, and we didn't have room in the 5-room apartment for the 2 of them. So he had to be put in a nursing home. Apartments in those days were at a premium because the war was on. My grandpa, on his way to the nursing home, they stopped at the house, and I went out to see him in the car, and he was sitting there uncomplaining as usual and said to me, "Oh, don't cry. Into each life a little rain must fall." He died 2 years later. We missed him. This is taken of my Nana in the early 40s. We were up at Door County. It was our first trip up there. We'd found such a wonderful place to stay that my dad said, "Let's have Nana come up and meet us here." She was living with us. Dad gave her the instructions. She was to go on the train to Manitowoc, Wisconsin, change to the bus, and get off at Gilbert Anderson's house. One of the friends put her on the train. She got onto the bus, and she said she wanted to get off at Anderson's. That is an impossible thing to do in Wisconsin at Door County because every other person's name was Anderson at that time. Finally, the bus driver put her off at the Anderson Hotel in Ephraim, and we dutifully met the bus and no Nana. After scurrying around trying to find her because the bus was supposed to slow down and stop and hadn't, the bus driver told us she was at Anderson's Hotel, and we picked her up and had a wonderful visit then. She died very soon after this picture and was, I'm sure, very happy to be back with my grandpa.
I really knew her for a couple of years after Jane Alyce and I started dating. Sometimes I felt that she was my best friend in the Gibbons household. She would often tell my girlfriend, "You're too mean to that nice boy." So once in a while, she and I would be visiting while your Nana put on the last of her makeup or whatever. When she'd come out and be ready to go, I didn't want to cut this nice lady off in the middle of a sentence, and so we'd stay and talk for a few minutes while my girlfriend was there tapping her foot at the door. She did die when Jane Alyce was a freshman at Rosary, and I unfortunately was not able to go to the wake. I was away at Notre Dame, but I missed her a lot too. Here's one we missed the first time around. This is Alex Clark, and it's dated January 1918. See the snow in the background. He certainly could be a dapper-looking guy in his fancy outfit, couldn't he? This was a precious document. This is a final certificate of naturalization for a minor. It was issued on the 11th of October, 1888 to one A.J. Clark, which of course made him an American citizen. We understand that he came to the United States at about the age of 12, and that he had brought with him, hand-carried, the China dog that I'm sure you guys remember from around the fireplace at home. We still have it down here and try to protect it. I hope it survives in the family for a long time. This is the earliest picture I have of my father, Andrew S. Wallach, the first that I know of. He was an only child born August 5th, 1897. He always said he made his first communion, confirmation, and graduation on the same day at the end of 6th grade. The next day he was sent out to get a full-time job. His father, being an old Dutchman, hung around with some Dutchmen who told him that lithography was a very good trade for a boy to learn. He was apparently naturally artistic anyway. So his father spoke to some friends who spoke to some friends, and he wound up as an assistant to a stone lithographer at the American Can Company. His job was to move 90-plus pound blocks of stone, smooth stone, around from place to place, and while the artists drew on them with what was called a lithographic crayon, a wax crayon. The process was that they would rub ink over the stone after it was finished, and then the wax would repel the ink in some places, and the places where there wasn't wax held the ink, and then they'd print with it. Very primitive form of printing. Things have improved a great deal, but that's what he did. He used to say that he kept a drawing board at the foot of his bed, and he would practice on it, hoping to become good enough to be promoted to artist, which of course he eventually was. In 1917, at the age of 20, he joined the Navy. He was sent to Newport News, Virginia for his basic training. Was there less than 2 weeks when one day he's on his way to a meal and he passed a young sailor trying to puzzle out how to install a lock in a door of a new barracks that was being built. My father, being very handy with tools, stopped to help him, was working away at it, and all of a sudden he became aware of another person standing there. He looked up to find the chief petty officer standing by. Of course, he jumped up and was going to be on his way, and the chief said, "No, no, Jack," which is what they called sailors, all sailors in those days. "Keep going." So my father kept going and installed the lock. The chief asked him what his name was in his unit, and he went on to dinner. Next day he was called out of ranks. Now he's just not 2 weeks into basic training, understand. Promoted to carpenter's mate and spent the rest of World War I building barracks for sailors at Newport News. After a while he moved off the base, and he used to took a room with a lady named Mrs. Mahoney. He being the only Catholic, she woke him every Sunday for Mass and then fixed him a big breakfast, which was quite a treat. A change from the Navy mess. Carpenter's mate Wallach is in the middle of this picture, second from the left, if you will. After he was discharged at the end of World War I, he came back and started in again working as an artist. I think he worked for Vogue Wright at that time. He was earning about $3 a week and had gotten to be a pretty good artist, I guess. One of his jobs was to design the Mr. Peanut for the Planters Peanut people. The Planters Company had run a contest for the public to design Mr. Peanut, and then they sent the drawing from the winner, in quotes, over to the Vogue Wright for an artist to do something along those lines. And my father is the one who did it. He probably joined the Knights of Columbus very shortly after the end of World War I. All the young men on the west side were joining the Barry Council of Knights of Columbus. I know Dick Gibbons was one of them. The D-Boys, Tom, Herbert, and Jean, were probably all there, and through them he met their daughter Marion, their sister Marion. They were married on June 12th of 1926. Guess who was their first child? This is the earliest picture I have of both Mom and myself. Look at the fancy dress she's wearing. When my parents were first married, they